The king's cub was already asleep against my door before I understood whose child he was. I stood frozen with my hand still wrapped around the wood latch, a basket of dried roots hanging from my wrist, while a small silver-furred body breathed softly across the threshold of my shelter. He had curled himself into the narrow strip of moonlit dirt as if he belonged there. One paw twitched in sleep. His ears were too large for his head. His coat, even dirty with leaves and dust, carried a pale sheen no village-born wolf pup ever had. I should have stepped back inside and barred the door. Instead, I crouched. The cub smelled faintly of cedar smoke, milk, and something colder beneath it. Clean, sharp, almost metallic. Not fear. Not wild forest. Bloodline. Power. The scent brushed the back of my throat and made every instinct in me tighten. Elian. Old Mara called from the next hut over, her voice dropping to a hiss. Don't touch it. Too late. The cub gave a sleepy sound and pushed his nose into my palm. The exile camp was never truly quiet, not even at night. Someone coughed behind thin walls. Firewood shifted in a dying pit. A baby fussed, then settled. But in that moment, every small sound around me seemed to draw away, as if the whole clearing were listening. I lifted my eyes. 3 villagers had stopped on the path above my shelter. Their faces were caught between suspicion and dread. No one came closer. It came from the upper road. One of them said, I saw tracks near the birch line. Another crossed herself against bad luck. Nothing good comes down from the palace after dark. They were right about that. The palace never forgot what it cast out. I looked back at the cub. A narrow leather band circled his neck, half hidden by fur. No jewels. No royal crest stamped in gold. But the stitching was too fine, the buckle too smooth, the leather too soft. Whoever had made it had never worried about cost. He did not belong in our camp, which meant if anyone from the palace was searching, they would not ask questions first. Go inside, Mara said again, sharper now. If the guards find him here, they'll blame you. That was possible. Likely even. Omegas like me did not need proof to be accused. Exiled ones needed even less. The smart choice was simple. Set the cub beyond the fence line. Walk away. Let whatever had lost him find him before dawn. But he had come to my door, and some stubborn, foolish part of me could not ignore that. I slid one arm beneath his warm little body and lifted him against my chest. He was heavier than he looked, solid with the kind of health hunger never touched. He woke just enough to blink at me with startling pale eyes, then pressed his muzzle beneath my chin and went limp again. A murmur moved through the villagers. Not because I had picked him up, because he had let me. I felt it too. Wolves, even young ones, knew rank by scent and instinct. They recoiled from weakness. They avoided omegas unless commanded otherwise. Yet this cub had crossed half a mile of forest, chosen my doorway, and settled there as though my heartbeat was the one he wanted to hear. That frightened me more than if he had bitten. I'll keep him until sunrise, I said quietly. Then I'll take him back to the upper ridge before the roads fill. You'll take him back. Mara stared at me like I had announced my own burial. Are you trying to die? No, I tightened my hold on the cub. I'm trying not to hand them a reason. That ended the argument, because everyone in exile understood what reasons became in palace hands. I stepped inside my shelter and shut the door with my heel. The room was small enough that 2 strides crossed it. A narrow bed, a table scarred by years of use, bundles of drying herbs hanging from the rafters. Rain tapped the roof in a thin, stubborn rhythm, soft at first, then hard enough to sound like thrown gravel. I stood with my back against the door for one breath, then another, letting the dark settle around me while the cub trembled in my arms. The air inside my shelter smelled of rosemary, damp wood, and the iron trace of fresh blood. Not much blood, enough to matter. I set the lantern on the table and turned the flame up. Warm gold spilled across the room and found him properly for the first time. His fur was too pale for any wild cub born beyond the palace walls, silver threaded through white like moonlight caught in snow. A leather cord, half hidden beneath his neck fur, flashed once before I tucked it out of sight on instinct. I should have taken that as a warning. Instead, I laid him on my bed. Don't bite me, I murmured, reaching for my basin. His ears twitched. A low sound rolled out of his chest, more exhausted than threatening. I had heard fear dressed as anger often enough to know the difference. Outside the palace, that lesson kept people alive. I poured clean water into a bowl, crushed yarrow between my fingers, and added a little comfort I had been saving. My supplies were never plentiful. Every leaf mattered out here. Every strip of linen had already lived another life before becoming a bandage. The cut along his side had crusted over with dirt and pine needles, and when I touched the swollen flesh around it, the cub flinched so violently he nearly fell off the bed. "Easy," I said, and my voice came out gentler than I expected. "If I wanted to hurt you, I would have left you in the rain." That seemed to offend him. A small growl buzzed through the room. Weak, but proud. Despite myself, I almost smiled. I cleaned the wound slowly. He fought me for the first few minutes, twisting, baring tiny sharp teeth, every inch of him insulted by needing help. But fever had already started to take hold. I felt it in the heat under his fur, in the way his breaths came too fast, in the sudden heavy sag of his body once the fight drained out of him. By the time I packed the salve into the gash and wrapped linen around his ribs, his head had fallen against my wrist. The contact stilled me. Omega scent was supposed to calm infants and unmated pups. That was old lore, the kind palace people laughed at unless it benefited them. I had not thought about it in years. Yet the moment my skin rested beneath his jaw, his breathing eased. Not by chance. Not by exhaustion alone. It changed as if some frightened part of him had finally decided the world, for one night at least, would not devour him. I swallowed against something painfully warm in my throat. No one had ever leaned into my touch like it was safety. I drew my hand back too quickly and busied myself with the fire. The flames were low, so I fed them 2 thin logs and watched sparks jump. The storm outside thickened. Wind pressed against the walls. Somewhere farther down the slope, one of the exiled villagers shouted for someone to secure their shutters, and another voice answered. 15 souls in this forgotten strip of land, all of us learning to hear danger before it arrived at the door. When I turned back, the cub was awake again, watching me. Not watching the room. Not watching the food. Me. His eyes were wrong. I had noticed the color outside, but not the shape of his attention. Most cubs looked with curiosity or simple need. This one looked as if he were measuring, choosing, remembering. There was intelligence in that steady silver gaze that made the hair rise on my arms. "You're not ordinary," I said quietly. He blinked once. Neither was I once. Not to them. Before Exile stripped a title down to a stain. The rain kept worrying at the roof. A dry-fingered tapping turned sharp and insistent by the wind. I fed another stick into the stove and watched the flame catch low, then stronger, breathing orange into the little room. Heat spread slowly, never enough to make winter kind, only enough to remind a body what kindness used to feel like. The cub had not moved far from the blanket I had given him. He sat with his front paws tucked beneath him, silver eyes fixed on me with that unsettling patience, as if he understood the shape of silence better than most people ever had. I should have slept. Instead, I crouched by the stove and held my hands over it, until feeling returned to my fingers in painful pins. "If you plan to bite me once you're stronger," I said, not looking at him, "do it before dawn. I hate surprises." The only answer was the crackle of damp wood and the distant moan of wind through the pines. When I finally glanced back, he was closer. Not by much. A foot, maybe 2. Enough that I knew he had crossed the room without sound. Enough that my shoulders tightened on instinct. I had lived too long by listening for what approached me in the dark. Men with smirks. Women with pity sharpened into contempt. Messengers carrying decrees with wax seals and dead eyes. In Exile, danger rarely announced itself twice. "Stay there," I murmured. The cub lowered himself to the floor, but he did not retreat. His ears flicked once. Snowmelt still darkened the fur along his flank where I had cleaned him. Beneath the smoke and herbs, I could catch his scent now. Cold forest, wet stone, and something finer threaded beneath it, something clean and piercing I could not name. It didn't smell wild. It smelled guarded. I rose, took the folded spare blanket from the chair, and laid it nearer the stove. "If you freeze, that will be your own stubborn fault." This time, he came when I stepped away. Not rushing, not crawling like a frightened thing. He moved with care, each small step deliberate, until he settled on the edge of the blanket. Then he looked up at me again, waiting. For what, I didn't know. I sat on the bed, boots still on, knife within reach on the crate beside the lamp. The room seemed smaller with another living thing inside it. Not fuller, just less forgiving. I was suddenly aware of every breath I took and every rough place in the walls where winter found a way in. The cub rested his chin on his paws, but his eyes never closed. "You don't trust me either," I said. That earned me the slightest tilt of his head. A laugh escaped before I meant to let it. It sounded rusty, like something pulled from under years of dust. "Good," I whispered. "Then at least one of us is sensible." The storm thickened. I could hear sleet striking the shutters now, harder than rain, then the heavier hush of snow beginning to fall over it. By midnight, no one from the village would brave the path. No one would come to ask for salve or dried roots or news from the lower road. For a few hours, the world had narrowed to one cabin, one failing fire, and one strange creature who watched me like I was the riddle. The wound in his side had stiffened him. I could see it every time he shifted. He was trying not to show pain, which was ridiculous in something that small and somehow familiar enough to make my chest ache. I knew too much about the pride of injured things. "Come here," I said before I could stop myself. He did not move. I exhaled through my nose. "Fine. Keep your dignity." Another gust shook the shutters. Cold pressed through the seams. The flame in the lamp fluttered. Then the cub stood, crossed the space between us, and stopped beside my bed. My whole body went still. For one suspended second, the room seemed to forget the storm. The cub stood beside my bed, close enough that I could see the darker line of damp fur along his spine, close enough that his warmth touched my bare hand where it rested on the blanket. He did not climb up. He did not whine. He only stood there, rigid with pride, as if coming this far had already cost him more than he wanted me to know. I moved slowly, giving him every chance to bolt. My fingers brushed the thick fur at his neck. He shivered. Not from fear. From exhaustion. "There," I whispered. "I'm not asking for more than you can give." The lamp flame bent low in another gust. In that wavering light, something flashed beneath the fur near his shoulder. Not silver. Not water. A hard, deliberate glint. A clasp. My breath caught. I parted the fur carefully and found a thin leather cord hidden beneath it, nearly swallowed by his coat. Tied to it was a small metal seal no bigger than a coin, pressed with the crest of the Frost line, a crown above a wolf's head, ringed in ivy thorns. Royal blood. Cold spread through me so fast it felt like a second storm had broken inside the room. "No," I said under my breath, though the proof sat in my hand. The cub's eyes lifted to mine. Too clear. Too steady. Not wild. Not lost. I had spent enough years near the palace before my exile to know what hidden things looked like. This was not a pet wandered too far from luxury. This was a child protected by secrecy, dressed in it, then somehow delivered to my door by instinct or desperation. And if a royal cub had come here night after night, then the danger surrounding my little shelter was larger than gossip, larger than cruelty. I let the seal fall back against his fur. "Who are you?" He could not answer in words, but his ears flattened at the question, and the look in his eyes made my stomach tighten. Not guilt. Recognition. As if he knew exactly who I was. Sleep did not come after that. The cub curled near the bed at last, one side pressed lightly against the frame, while I sat awake listening to the rain weaken toward dawn. My mind kept circling the same impossible thought. Royal blood did not leave the palace unguarded. Not by accident. Not unless someone had failed, or someone had lied. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world rinsed and raw. The cub woke before sunrise, already alert. When I opened the door to shake water from the cloth I had used on him, he slipped outside and paused in the pale blue light, looking back once before disappearing toward the trees. I should have let him go. Instead, I pulled on my boots and followed. The earth was soft beneath my soles, the path marked by small tracks darkening the mud. The woods beyond my shelter still held rain in every branch. Water dripped on my shoulders and slid down the back of my neck, but I kept going, careful and quiet. The trail did not wander like an animal's. It moved with purpose, toward the old north boundary road. My chest tightened. That road had once been used by supply carts from the palace before the route was changed after my exile. Few villagers went near it now. Fewer still would risk using it before full morning. I stayed behind the trees until the path opened to the ruined boundary marker stone. The cub was there. He stood in the road, tail low, facing a rider cloaked in dark gray. One of the palace guards. Even at this distance, I knew the cut of the uniform beneath the wet cloak, the disciplined stillness in the man's posture. He had come alone, which made the meeting worse, not better. The guard dismounted and dropped to one knee. Not to me. To the cub. My pulse slammed hard enough to hurt. Rain ran off the guard's hood in thin silver lines while the cub held perfectly still in the middle of the road, as if the kneeling man had presented himself before a throne instead of a muddy boundary stone split by frost and time. I did not breathe. I do not think I even blinked. The guard kept his head bowed. "Your Highness," he said, low enough that the storm nearly swallowed it. "They've begun the count." The cub did not move toward him. My hand tightened around the blanket. The room behind me still carried the small warmth of the fire, the smell of damp wool and herbs. But the world outside that broken doorway had shifted under my feet. A palace guard did not kneel to a stray creature. He did not use that title by mistake. The man lifted his eyes just enough to look at the cub, not at me. "The court nobles noticed your empty rooms before dawn. The palace guards covered one watch change, then another. We told them you were hunting in the northern range. It bought us half a day." His jaw set hard. "No more." The cub's ears flattened. I should have stepped back. I should have closed the door and let the palace drag its secrets away from my threshold. Instead, I found myself crossing the floor until rain struck my face and cold mud soaked through the hem of my clothes. The guard finally looked at me then, and the recognition in his expression was immediate and brutal. Not disgust. Worse. Alarm. "Step away from him," he said. The order landed like a slap. I stopped in the road, every old lesson rising at once. Exiled. Untouchable. Unfit to stand near what belonged to the throne. Yet the cub turned his head toward me first, amber eyes bright in the gray light, and something in my chest hardened against the guard's fear. "He came here on his own," I said. The guard rose in one swift motion. Rain darkened the leather at his shoulders and ran down the wolf crest stamped over his chest. "That is exactly the problem." The cub let out a soft sound, not quite a growl, but enough to pull the guard short. For the first time, I understood that this was not simply a secret visit that had gone too far. Adrian Frost had not slipped beyond the palace for an hour of rebellion. His absence had become a crack inside the kingdom, and I was standing in it. The guard lowered his voice. "If the bond forms beyond denial, the court nobles will force separation before sunset. If they believe an exiled Omega has influenced the air," he cut himself off, but he did not need to finish. I had lived long enough to know how fast powerful people dressed fear in righteous language. "Then why come alone?" I asked. He studied me as if deciding whether honesty was reckless or necessary. "Because not all 12 of us would obey the same command today." That chilled me more than the rain. The palace guards were loyal to the throne. If even one of them had split in purpose, then the court was already pressing where it hurt. Not just on Adrian, on everyone around him. The cub took 2 steps and pressed his wet side against my leg. The guard's face changed at that, some last hope falling away. "They were right," he said quietly. He chose the same path again. Again. So this had not begun with tonight or the night before. Every silent visit, every hour Adrian Frost had spent curled near my bed while I believed I was protecting a lost young wolf had been a choice made against the weight of his own world. A second sound cut through the rain. Not thunder. Hoofbeats. The guard heard them too and turned at once toward the trees. They sent trackers. His curse was nearly soundless. I told them to search the eastern ridge. "How many?" I asked. He listened, counting in the space between impacts. The hoofbeats multiplied until the wet ground seemed to carry them under my skin. I counted with the guard because fear was easier to bear when it had numbers. 1, 3, 6. More behind them. Too many riders for a search made in silence. Too many for a prince who had slipped beyond the palace walls without permission and an Omega already marked as disposable by the people who ruled from stone and silver. The cub did not move from the center of the road. Rain darkened his fur until he looked carved from midnight. Stillness sat on him strangely now that I knew what he was. Not weakness, not confusion, restraint. Adrian Frost held himself there, as if one step in either direction would decide more than this night. The guard rose from one knee, water running from his cloak. "If they see him here, they will report to the palace before dawn." "They are already here," I said. A torch flared between the trees. Then another. Not palace discipline. Palace guards moved in ordered pairs, quiet even through storm and brush. These lights jumped too fast, voices too loud, boots careless with mud and roots. The first rider broke through the pines with a strip of dark cloth tied around his arm. Not royal colors, but the kind men wore when they wanted to hide who had paid them. 5 came into view. Others circled wider in the brush. The horses snorted at the scent of wolf and smoke. The lead man saw my shelter behind me and smiled with half his mouth. So this is where the exile keeps his secrets. The guard beside me went rigid. Get inside. It should have been simple. Bolt the door. Let the prince return to those who had raised walls around him. Let my own fate remain my own. But the riders were looking at the cub, and the cub was looking at me. I understood then with a sharp, sick clarity that if Adrian ran now, they would follow his trail straight back to the palace and drag the truth behind him. If he stayed, they would try to kill what they thought was only an animal and punish the Omega who sheltered it. Safety had already broken. The only choice left was who would stand in the fire. I stepped into the road before the guard could stop me. This land has nothing worth stealing, I said. Turn back. A laugh answered me. The nobles said you'd lie. Nobles. Not a patrol, then. Not an accident. Someone inside the palace had sent men who did not wear the crown so the crown could deny them later. The guard swore under his breath and drew his blade. Behind me. No. The word left me before thought could soften it. I had spent too many years obeying fear. Tonight, fear would have to follow. The lead rider lifted a torch and threw it. It struck the side wall of my shelter. Dry straw packed under the eaves caught first, then the old boards, flame racing bright and ugly through rain that was no longer strong enough to smother it. Heat slapped my face. One of the exile villagers shouted from farther down the slope. A door opened, then another. Shadows moved between huts as the fire painted them gold. Everything changed at once. The guard lunged for the nearest horse, dragging its rider down into the mud. I ran for the burning wall with a bucket that had been left by the steps. Water hissed uselessly against the lower boards. The fire climbed higher. Smoke shoved into my lungs. Behind me, steel rang out once, then again. A snarl ripped through the night. Not the cry of a frightened cub. The first horse reared so hard it nearly toppled backward. Men shouted. One torch dropped. In the red light, I saw Adrian leap. Not as a child hiding at my hearth, but as what he had been born to become. He hit a rider full in the chest, sending both of them crashing into the road. Mud splashed cold against my shins as the rider Adrian had struck rolled across the road with him locked on top of him like a wolf that had finally chosen its teeth. For one stunned second, every man there forgot I existed. Fire crackled behind us. Horses screamed. The smell of wet leather, smoke, and blood pressed so thick into the air it felt chewable. That was when I moved. Not toward the fight. Toward the law. The dropped torch hissed in the rain-soft mud, its flames still alive at one end. I snatched it up and crossed the road in 3 strides, straight to the black carriage marked with the palace crest. The driver had fallen. One of the palace guards was on one knee nearby, trying to rise with blood running down his temple. He looked at me as if I had no right to touch anything bearing that symbol. I drove the torch into the carriage curtain. Dry fabric caught at once. Gold thread blackened. Flame raced upward. A noblewoman inside shrieked. Another voice barked for the fire to be put out. 3 mounted men who had been circling toward Adrian turned hard in their saddles and swore. In a breath, their purpose broke. No one guarding the throne could ignore a royal crest burning in open sight. It was not a rescue. It was a choice. I was giving Adrian room by making the palace save its own face first. The nearest guard stared at me in disbelief. Are you insane? Yes, I said, and kicked the carriage step loose so it collapsed under the first man rushing to climb in. By then Adrian was already back on his feet. Rain slicked his dark hair against his forehead, but there was nothing boyish left in him now. His shoulders were broader than the doorframe of my shelter, his hands stained with mud and blood, his chest rising like he had inhaled the whole storm. The rider he had thrown down did not stand again. One of the court nobles pushed through the confusion, cloak half burned at the hem, face white with fury. I knew him by sight, though I had never spoken to him. One of the 8. One of the men who had watched my sentence without lifting a hand. Seize the Omega, he shouted. The air has been bewitched. The word hit harder than the smoke had. Not because I had never heard it. Because Adrian heard it too. He turned toward me then, and the entire road changed around that turn. Not with violence. With decision. 2 palace guards reached for me from either side. Adrian crossed the space before they touched me. His arm came out in a single brutal line, knocking one man back by the throat. The other froze when Adrian's scent broke fully into the rain. Raw pine, iron, and the unmistakable pressure of royal alpha blood. It rolled over the road, so suddenly even the horses stamped and tossed their heads. "Stand down," Adrian said. Nobody moved. The noble recovered first. "Your Highness, step away from him. Palace law is clear. An exiled Omega cannot be harbored, touched, or claimed by the throne." Claimed. The word seemed to split the night open. I felt every eye find us at once. The palace guards, the remaining nobles, even the exiled villagers who had begun to gather beyond the ditch with lanterns clutched tight to their chests. 15 shadows I knew by shape before face. People who had shared stale bread with me. People who also knew what happened when palace law decided your body was no longer yours. Adrian looked at the noble, then at me. There should have been hesitation, fear, calculation. He had a kingdom behind him and a crown ahead of him. I had a leaking roof, smoke in my lungs, and a name the palace spoke like a stain. Instead, he came closer. Rain slid down his cheekbone. A cut at his lip had started to bleed again. Rain gathered at the edge of the noble's jaw and dropped into the churned mud between us. Blood thinned at Adrian Frost's mouth, bright even in the gray light, and for one sharp breath the whole road seemed to hold still around it. The fallen horse snorting, the exiled villagers silent at my back, the palace guards gripping their spears as if they no longer knew which danger to face first. Then one of the court nobles laughed, too loudly, too quickly. "That is enough," he snapped, trying to stand straighter even with mud on his silk. "Your Highness, step away from him. This filth has already poisoned the road. Do not let it stain the throne." I felt the words the way I always had, not as surprise, but as something older, like a bruise pressed in the same place. Adrian Frost did not step away. Instead, he bent and seized the noble by the front of his soaked coat, hauling him up just enough to force eye contact. "Say it again," he said softly. That was what frightened them. Not the violence, not the rain, not even the way all 12 palace guards had lowered their weapons without moving closer. It was how quiet he sounded. The noble swallowed. "You shame your blood for an Omega who was lawfully exiled." My heartbeat stumbled. Lawfully. There it was again. The word that had built my ruin. Mud sucked at my boots as I took a step forward before I could stop myself. "Ask him why," I said. Every face turned. The noble looked at me with naked contempt. "Because you broke sacred order." "No," I said, and my own voice surprised me. It was shaking, but it did not break. "Because your families needed someone weaker than you to bury the truth." A murmur ran through the 8 court nobles like a crack through ice. Adrian Frost's hand loosened on the man's coat, not in mercy, but in attention. He looked at me fully then, rain running over his lashes, and I understood that this was the moment he had never forced from me. He had waited, even when waiting cost him certainty. So I gave him the truth. "I was not exiled for dishonor," I said. "I was exiled because I witnessed what happened in the South Wing the night the old treaty ledgers were burned." One of the nobles went pale. Another started forward. "He lies." I pointed at him. "You carried the oil jar." The road went silent again. Memory came back with the smell first. Lamp oil. Smoke under a door. The sharp panic of servants shoved from the hall so no one would ask why records about Omega protections, inheritance rights, and unlawful bond claims had to disappear before dawn. I had been working that night, invisible the way Omegas in service were meant to be. Invisible until I saw too much. "You were there," I said. "All of you knew the ledgers proved exile law had been twisted for years. Omegas marked inconvenient, heirs displaced, claims erased. You needed the records gone. When I spoke, you called me unstable, then impure, then dangerous. By morning, I was outside the gates. Rain struck harder, drumming on leather and wood and skin. The noble Adrian Frost had thrown into the mud found his voice first. Even if that were true, he has no proof." "I do," Adrian Frost said. The words hit me harder than the rain. He reached inside his coat and drew out the packet I had once seen him protect with almost unnatural care. Oilcloth, tied at the center. He opened it with wet fingers and pulled free a half-burned ledger page. I knew it before he spoke. I knew the blackened edge, the wax seal stamped with the Royal Archive, the column of names cut off by flame. "I found it hidden in the nursery wall," he said. My breath caught. The nursery. The place where the small wolf cub had kept escaping the palace to come to me. The place where no one would think a child's room held treason. The nursery wall had kept its secret longer than the throne had kept its honor. Adrian Frost stood across from me in the gray edge of dawn, rain still clinging to his hair, the half-burned ledger page trembling once in his hand before he stilled it. I took it from him carefully, as if the paper itself might bruise. There were names in the surviving column. Supplies diverted. Sentences issued without seal. Exiles marked as necessary removals. At the bottom, beneath smoke stains and torn fibers, one line remained clear enough to cut. Vale household. Purge authorized to protect succession. For a second, the world made no sound. Not the wind outside my shelter. Not the drip from Adrian Frost's sleeve onto the floorboards. Not my own breath. He saw when I understood. I watched the grief move through his face before he said a word, because the truth had reached him too. My exile had never been justice. It had been housekeeping. A child hidden, a bloodline feared, a future rearranged by hands inside the palace long before either of us was old enough to resist it. The order was signed under Regency authority, he said quietly. Not by my father. By the council acting in his illness. The council, the 8 court nobles who had spoken of order while people vanished beyond the palace boundary. The same families who had looked at me like a stain. The same ones who had watched Adrian Frost's cub form curl against my door and had called it corruption instead of trust. I folded the ledger page once. Then again. If you carry that back to the throne, I said, they will tell you to bury it. He did not answer at once. That frightened me more than if he had. Outside, the exile villagers had begun to gather in the wet morning light. 15 souls who had built a life from cast-off wood, patched roofs, and one another's mercy. Beyond them, at the edge of the clearing, the 12 palace guards waited in a rigid line, mud dark on their boots, duty still holding their shoulders square even after everything they had seen. No one spoke. The whole world felt balanced on Adrian Frost's next breath. At last, he lifted his eyes to mine. I know. There was no crown on his head. No wolfskin mantle. No gold. Just a man who had been raised for a throne since childhood, standing in my broken doorway with evidence that the throne itself had rotted under him. I thought he would ask me to come back with him, to help him reclaim it, to stand beside him while he cleansed the court and rebuilt the palace from the inside. That was the ending power usually chose. Keep the shape. Change the names. Call it mercy. Instead, Adrian Frost stepped past me, out into the clearing where everyone could hear. His voice carried clean through the rain-washed air. You were wrongfully exiled, he said, not to me alone, but to the villagers, the guards, the waking sky. And the old order that did it was built on fear, theft, and lies. One of the palace guards shifted. A noble argument would have begun there, once. Procedure. Inquiry. Delay. Adrian Frost did not leave room for any of it. I was raised to inherit a throne, he said. But I will not inherit its cowardice. My heart hit hard against my ribs. The 12 guards looked at him with the stunned stillness of men hearing history split open. He unclasped the signet from his cloak, the royal crest worked in silver, and held it in his palm for one last second. Then he turned and set it on the wet stump beside my door. Not dropped. Not thrown. Given back. Gasps broke from the clearing. Even the wind seemed to stop and listen. If the palace wants a king, Adrian Frost said, let it crown one of the 8 who taught it how to devour the innocent. I won't rule by their poison. I won't ask him to survive it again. Him. Not exile.